Okay, I think we're going to start. Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. I'd like to begin by acknowledging and paying respects to the Gadigal people, the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which this university was built. I pay my respects to their elders, both past and present. So my name is Louisa. I'm a PhD candidate at the Digital Media Research Centre at QUT, and I'm a student member of the ADM+S. I'm really delighted to be chairing this panel today. I'll be stepping in for my colleague, Dr. Ariadna Matamoros Fernandez, who is unfortunately unwell, so couldn't be with us today. But for all of you who know Ariadna, she does a lot of preparation in advance, so she's made it very easy for me, which means that if anything goes wrong, you can blame it on me and my jet lag, but I'm hoping that won't be the case. So yes, in this panel, we're going to be discussing some of the promise and perils of automated systems for content moderation. And we've got a wonderful group of experts on the panel to discuss this. And I'll begin by just briefly introducing them. So to my left, I've got Rita Jabri Markwell. She is a solicitor with Birchgrove Legal Group, and she serves as legal, policy, and strategic advisor for Aman. With Aman, which stands for Australian Muslim Advocacy Network, she uses legal tools, research, and advocacy to promote the human rights of Australian Muslims. Rita's also a member of the Christchurch Call Advisory Network, and we're really delighted that she could be with us today. Next, we've got Lucinda Nelson, who is a PhD candidate affiliated with Queensland University of Technology, and she's also a student member of ADM+S. Lucinda's research investigates the manifestation and spread of misogyny on social media platforms, and she's particularly focused on more covert forms of misogyny and the ways that this can subtly entrench cultures of violence towards women. Dr. Aaron Snoswell is a postdoctoral research fellow at the ADM+S. He's affiliated with Queensland University of Technology. Aaron is a computer scientist, and his postdoctoral research focuses on developing socio-technical interventions for reducing toxicity in the foundation model machine learning paradigm. So currently, Aaron is looking in particular at the ways sexism and misogyny manifests in large language models. And last, but certainly not least, we have Joanna Williams. Joanna is a PhD candidate at the ADM+S, and she's affiliated with Swinburne University. In her research, she investigates how Australian sexual health organizations use digital media for digital sexual health promotion, aimed at young people in particular. And as part of this, she also investigates how organizations perceive social media platform moderation of sexuality education and how that influences what type of content they create. So the way this session is going to work is that each of the 4 panelists will make an opening statement of about 5 minutes. We'll then have a 20-minute panel discussion. I'll ask them a couple of questions as prompts. And then we'll very quickly open up for a broader Q&A. Hopefully we'll have time for quite a lot of that. So if you have any burning questions while everyone is speaking, please put them on Slido and we'll get to them as soon as possible. So with that, Rita, can I ask you to start your opening statement?
Good afternoon, everyone. Just like to acknowledge we're meeting on the lands of, which people am I meeting on? Okay, Gadigal people. Okay, so Aman has been problem solving in this space for a few years of how to basically to prevent another Christchurch massacre occurring. And so we've been very interested in what intervention points exist online for disrupting racist, nationalist, conspiracy theory, anti-Islam, demographic invasion theories, Great Replacement theory, and the point that most platforms, including major ones like Meta, will disrupt things where they see very explicit words like white nationalist or white supremacist or Nazi, but not where narratives are conveyed. And so we were looking at, well, how do you identify discourse? So some of the challenges we see for automated systems, one is that this needs to be treated as a public harm. It can't be complaint driven. It can't be by consumers. We need automated systems that take responsibility and do the heavy lifting in terms of monitoring and escalating the most prolific actors, I suppose, in terms of who run a business online of spreading these theories. We need the automated systems that are resilient to changes in which target groups are being targeted, because we have seen shifts over past months and years of, Muslims were a major targeted group. More recently, we see the trans community being targeted, women, a consistent target group. And we also need to have systems which can assess more than one piece of evidence at a time, because that's a major gap at the moment. It seems most systems seem to be looking at one piece at a time rather than patterns of harm over time. And the final thing is that whatever standard, there needs to be some transparency about the standard that is being used to identify material that is dehumanizing, because while there are many different definitions for racism and for hate speech and for different forms of prejudice, whether it be ableism or sexism or whatever form of prejudice, there is great strength in having a standard that is universal enough that it applies to me, to you, to any group when it comes to dehumanizing material, given the link between dehumanization and genocides and atrocities historically. Dehumanization has been found to be an excellent disruption point because it is a consistent theme of a lot of violent extremist movements across the spectrum, whether it's racist nationalism or ISIS, and it's also used in non-violent extremist or non-terrorist spaces to socialise people towards violence. There's been some work by the Christchurch Call Advisory Network on dehumanising speech and discourse. Aman has been leading some work on defining dehumanising material, and just overnight has published a further update to its working definition, which is on its website, which you can find now at aman.net.au, aman.net.au. And that definition aims to set a standard that would apply to any group on the basis of a protected characteristic of what is not acceptable, and is quite clear and apparent on the face of it, as opposed to most definitions of hate speech, which require sort of proof of the effect of this speech. This is more about defining exactly what it looks like, which is easier from an automated systems approach. So I encourage you to have a look at that. Thank you.
Hi everyone. Thanks to everyone who managed to make it in for the final session after a packed couple of days. I'm going to, in this sort of brief introduction, give you a little bit of an introduction to my project, and then also just talk about a couple of the main things that I see as challenges for automated content moderation. There's actually quite a few overlaps between our work, so I'm really excited for this discussion. So my project aims to understand everyday online misogyny, and what I mean by that is the types of misogynistic expression that are not overtly hostile. So it's not things like slurs and swear words, but it's sort of more focused on the misogyny that hides in quote-unquote civil discourse. As part of that, this project as well, I look to the role that platform policies and affordances play in the creation and spread of everyday online misogyny. So for example, that can be things like monetization of content or recommender systems on different platforms. And I'm also aiming to identify some distinguishing features of everyday online misogyny that we might be able to use with automated tools to detect and address everyday forms of online misogyny at scale. I look at this particularly in the context of discussions of violence against women. So the case study that I am using for my PhD project is the Depp and Heard trial. And I'm looking at a number of different platforms so that I can compare how their affordances and policies kind of shape that discourse. I'm very fortunate to be a part of the ADM+S and to be supported with using digital methods. So there's a lot of collaboration I do a lot of collaboration with computer scientists like Snoswell and data scientists to help me kind of deal with some of these things at a much bigger scale than anyone doing qualitative methods alone normally can handle. So I'm very fortunate for that. Two of the main challenges that I see with dealing with everyday online misogyny using automated content moderation. The first one is that there are really difficult normative decisions to be made. This isn't unique to automated content moderation or to everyday online misogyny. So whenever you're moderating content, there are going to be trade-offs and difficult decisions to be made. But particularly in everyday online misogyny, because it's not something that's as universally recognized as harmful, because it's something that isn't quite as extreme, it's a really difficult space to try and balance things like free speech against the kind of desire to protect survivors of violence from harm when they speak out about it. And then the second thing that is a really major challenge in this area is detection. So as Rita touched on, automated tools typically aren't very good at dealing, or historically haven't been very good at dealing with content in context, firstly. So there tends to be this kind of understanding of content as individual pieces of content. And also what has been sort of coming up more lately in research is that a lot of the tools that automatically rate things like toxicity or kind of badness actually tend to measure incivility rather than underlying harmful ideologies. So that's when people are using swear words or getting angry at each other, but it doesn't really address when there's, harmful things underpinning that. So an example of this is in some incel spaces. There are like very healthy, happy incel communities internally. They're all functioning really well together, but the sort of underlying ideology is really harmful to women, and then that sort of seeps out beyond those spaces. Yes, I'll leave it at that for now, and we can talk more.
Great. So my name's Snoswell. I'm a research fellow, as you heard, here at ADM+S. My project is called the Toxicity Scalpel and involves two main objectives. And so the first one is looking at developing new methods to reduce toxicity in language models like ChatGPT. And the focus there is on methods that are actually accessible. And so you may not be aware of this, but the sort of predominant approach that is being used by the OpenAIs of the world to align, in bunny ears, these models with human values and preferences is reinforcement learning from human feedback and similar type approaches, which tend to be quite data intensive or compute intensive and require sort of a large budget in terms of human labeling and human effort to follow those procedures. And so trying to come up with methods that are accessible in the sense that people other than big tech companies can actually use them, so perhaps individual researchers, and methods that are broadly applicable, so trying to intervene at the foundation model stage where you have a general machine learning model that is then used in many different domains. And so by intervening at the earlier stage in the pipeline, you can hopefully have a broader impact and affect more applications. And then the second aim in my project is in developing methods to actually measure and evaluate toxicity more effectively. And so the focus here is on being more grounded in subject matter expertise and experiences or lived experiences of experts in that area, and being more responsive to context. And so I work very closely with Lucinda in that setting. And the case study there is on misogyny as a form of sexism. So how does all of that relate to content moderation? Well, I gave some thought to that. Language models, I think we can all agree, are going to be increasingly used to produce and co-produce content in online spaces. We're already seeing that in a big way. And so this is actually going to smuggle toxicity into the online everyday discourses that we have in our digital platforms. And so if we can try and actually mitigate this issue at the sort of front end, it's a form of content pre-moderation, if you like, and trying to nip it in the bud, if you like. But also, on the other side, tools that we use to measure toxicity, for example, in language online, are often the same tools that were actually used for automated content moderation. And so the big example here is the Perspective API by Jigsaw or Google, which has many limitations. But on the same side, if we can develop better tools for measuring toxicity, maybe they can also be more useful for content moderation. And I'll end quickly by just saying I think there's a big opportunity here at the moment. particularly, like we've heard already, the importance of not just considering data in isolation, but looking at stories and the bigger context. I think, the current evaluation approaches that are used in automated systems just really lag behind not even new advances in the internet, just old advances in the internet. So in terms of data, like platforms like TikTok, for example, that are primarily video-based, right? How many video-capable toxicity evaluation APIs are out there? I don't know of any, but maybe someone could educate me on that. They tend to focus on data like text, right? Or very limited sort of variations of that theme. And then in terms of even just context, so the internet, how long have we had threaded comments on internet platforms, right? Where someone responds in a thread sort of format, and yet most toxicity evaluation APIs for automated moderation consider pieces of text in isolation without sort of any support for hierarchical structure like a threaded sort of layout. And so, and of course, geographical and cultural norms and sort of preferences and nuances. So I think there's a big opportunity here where the technology perhaps is maturing to be able to actually handle some of these differences. But I'll stop there and hand it to you.
Okay, so obviously there's a lot of challenges and promises that we've already gone through. And what I talk about and what I research about is a little bit different from everyone else, in that instead of looking at what's kind of, erroneously, hopefully kept on, not hopefully, but what is erroneously kept on social media platforms, what I look at is what is actually removed, what is rejected. And given that we're talking about particularly women today, I want to just recognize that the erroneous kind of removal of sexual content doesn't just affect women, it affects people of all genders, but the sexist assemblages of social media often mean that these are experienced most heavily by women, but queer people as well, particularly transgender people. So you can see some of the work that I've done behind me, which was I used to run a sexual health web series called Bits and Bods, which talked to teen girls and gender diverse teens about sex bodies and all the awkward bits in between. And we started to create playful kind of content like this through Instagram in about 2016. And that went on absolutely fine for a couple of years until Sesta Foster came out in 2018. And by 2019, we'd not only been deleted from Instagram for our very pornographic imagery that you can see behind us, but we'd also not been able to put advertising behind any of the educational web series that we created, which in part was government funded. So basically, I came into this PhD trying to contextualize that experience, understanding why that happened and whether or not this was affecting other health promotion organisations, both in Australia and overseas. I've interviewed social media workers from 12 sexual health organisations, as well as contextualising that experience within policy analysis of how Meta's content moderation policies represent sexual content. And unfortunately, I found out very quickly that my experience was the experience of so many other sexual health organisations. And this was despite these organisations actually producing the type of content that Meta wants us to produce, which is content aimed at people over the age of 18 that is explicitly educational. And this goes back to what we've been saying before about the fact that context plays such a huge role and that there's an inability of automated content moderation at this point in time to be able to differentiate between pornographic and educational content. But the thing that really kind of stood out to me is how this differed from the existing kind of academic conversation around content moderation, which has really been traditionally about the removal of content. So all of these organisations were saying that the main thing that was affecting them was actually the rejection of paid advertising, which really hasn't been explored in content moderation except for political advertising. So people's ads were being removed for using words like pleasure, using words like clitoris and vagina, which when you're talking about a body, you can't really ignore the parts of the body that are involved with sex. And this creates a lot of frustration. So you see this picture behind me here, which was a picture that was rejected by when Gen West was putting a campaign out, which is quite obviously about consent. This was rejected for advertising sexual services or sexual goods. And I'm sure that there are some people that have a lot of issues with pornography or vibrators, but I still struggle to understand, even with the flagging of that, because the word sex was involved, why that was removed erroneously. And this is incredibly frustrating for all organisations when they're trying to put content out and they're not able to go through the things. But the biggest issue is that because stigma is like, it halts conversations about sex on social media to start with. So these sexual health organisations that are wanting to start conversations and share information aren't able to get to the young people because they're not searching, they're not liking, and they're not sharing. So it felt like a bit of bad news until I started to realise this is actually affecting the type of content that is that is being produced going forward. So instead of just producing the type of content that young people wanted to engage with, like the stuff that I used to produce with bits and bods, instead what we're seeing is organisations are increasingly self-censoring. They're removing content around, anal sex, around pleasure, around queer experiences, because they're really scared that that's going to trigger content moderation and they're going to be taken down. Or alternatively, they're trying to hide the conversation through memes. They're trying to hide the conversations through algo speak. But young people aren't going to be able to find, they're not going to be able to find something that's misspelt. How can we expect people to be able to engage in these environments and to actually learn and reach them if we can't talk about the issues and that there's no capability to move this forward? So I came into this being, a little disillusioned. But in the last year, there's actually been really positive change. And I hope that the learnings of the power of documenting these experiences is actually going to be able to help us move forward when it comes to, being able to show how context isn't working in these things. So after having no change in kind of the Facebook advertising policies for about 10 years, the Centre for Intimacy Justice has managed to absolutely change the way that sexual health services and that sexual health products can be advertised, as long as they can't talk about pleasure, of course. And we've also seen significant changes that have been at least broached with Meta around the community standards to do with sexual content. So there's a lot of potential going forward. And I've got a lot of hope that, particularly when we have amazing people working together from different disciplines and different areas, like Lucinda and Aaron are talking, that we actually have the potential to work with the platforms to move this forward.
Thank you so much. So now we're going to go into a little panel discussion, and you can feel free to use this time to put your questions into Slido. My first question is, as you know, of course, there's been a lot of discussion, a lot of criticism around content moderation. It's been going on for a long time, and we're starting to see regulation that is considered quite groundbreaking. But it's also attracted a lot of criticism. So in Australia, of course, in the EU, in the UK, I wonder if you have any thoughts about if there is any model that you think is better than the other, what you're hopeful for or worried about when it comes to these emerging regulatory models. Anyone can start?
I'd love to answer this question. Okay. All right. Okay, so the European model is talked about, it's often touted as the strongest thing out there. The Digital Services Act, and there's also a more prescriptive piece of legislation to do with terrorist content. The Digital Services Act is being criticised as being a bit high level, which I think a speaker was speaking about yesterday. And it does really focus on systems level change and responsibility and risk assessment. I do think that there's some scope for some good research and civil society discernment of harms through some of the infrastructure they've talked about with the Digital Services Act. But in general, I don't think it's an excellent tool for communities at all. Because it still doesn't make it clear that, apart from misogyny, that for example, racism and dehumanizing material is a public harm, and that worries me. The online safety bill in the UK again fell down on this particular point. They had tried to deal with online hatred by talking about lawful but awful material. That fell down. It was removed from the last iteration of that bill because of concerns about free expression, which were probably quite legitimate because it was very poorly worded and ambiguously worded. I think a lot of policymakers and lawmakers have struggled with how to define the standard when it comes to hate speech online in a way that we talk about that fits on at scale and is kind of apparent and visible, which is the exact problem that we've been trying to problem solve the last few years. And we just really hope that that the Australian government doesn't sort of just fall down that hole of saying it's too hard, or I think at the moment the Australian government is looking at its Online Safety Act, which has protections for individuals and children who are targeted, but not for groups who are targeted on the basis of protected characteristics. And I think the easiest thing for them to be would be to extend their existing provisions to communities, but we've recommended against that because that would essentially mean that it would be again a complaint mechanism that communities have to bring. So again, the communities, we're carrying the burden of the social cost of monitoring what's happening on platforms, of bringing complaints, of proving that it harms us, and that's just not what we want. And the other reason why we don't want them to just extend those provisions is because they currently require proof of psychological harm, which is why only a very small number of people have actually succeeded to use those provisions. And we are making the point that dehumanisation online is a form of psychological violence. It's a form of harm in itself. We shouldn't have to prove that it leads to harm, because it's very hard to do that in a legal sense. So.
Yeah, a lot of those things cross over quite neatly as well. Conveniently, it's almost like this panel was prepared for these reasons. So I guess the first point that's really important to make here is that legislation is never going to directly address the content that I'm talking about in my sort of research. So these things, like everyday forms of online misogyny, are not going to reach a threshold that the law requires to intervene in. So I guess I have some hope that these sort of process-based regulations, as opposed to sort of content-based regulations that, require impact assessments and risk assessments, might have some impact, some positive impact in trying to sort of shape things for better. But that's not going to be enough alone. I don't think that's a huge surprise to anyone, but I think it's worth reiterating that dealing with this sort of cultural level stuff needs a concerted effort from a bunch of different people. So, platforms themselves are going to play a really important role in addressing things that aren't like beyond what's just prohibited, and in shaping, cultures online in a better way. I think the other thing that's really important to note here, and I can speak probably more to the Australian experience of the latest online safety legislation, because I was involved in some of the consultations around that, is that some of this legislation very much not, there was very limited time for people to comment. So the procedure for that legislation coming about was very problematic. So for example, between one stage of consultation, the report being released, but there was about 5 days between one of the reports being released and then the next round of consultations being due, which is not enough time for anyone to give proper and meaningful feedback on that. And also that this is a little bit patchwork, I suppose. So we've got legislation that's kind of been pushed in quite quickly in a lot of ways. And there were a lot of, it was largely based on, or not largely, but in part based on some really outdated legislation that we've got. So our classification guidelines, for example, and Joe will be able to talk more to this, are really not in line, for the most part, with, current standards of what's socially acceptable. So a lot of sex workers are going to be severely impacted, just for an example of one group, by this new legislation. And it's also a little bit kind of confusing because we have a classification review going on at the same time. So I think a lot of us in the policy space are a bit like, well, why are we doing this before we've dealt with sort of the standards that we're going to be implementing? So potentially some you know, hope for good, but there's also a lot of very legitimate harms that have already been, you know, proven and spoken about a lot that aren't really being addressed yet.
Should I jump in now? Yep.
Yeah, good segue.
Well, I think jumping off that, I think there is actually a lot for us to learn from the implementation of Foster-Sester. So we can learn that well-intentioned policies can have unintended effects, but what we need to do is we need to learn to listen to the people who are pointing out the unintended effects before they start. So I think that particularly with the Online Safety Act, the fact that there wasn't really, it's kind of like with Meta, the use of terminology is so vague that it could mean everything or it could mean nothing. And we often look at these policies and how this legislation and how it's enforced, thinking it's going to be well enforced with people with like the right intentions. But at the moment, there's kind of no checks and balances. There's no transparency around that happening. And, you know, maybe the e-safety commissioner who potentially has links to anti-porn groups in the US, you know, might not implement any of these things to particularly affect the way that sexual content, which could be educational sexual content, it could be, you know, the selfie that you're wanting to send to the person that you're seeing, or it could be pornography that you're wanting to view. But it could also be that they just want to get them off the internet and they'll use that. So there needs to be a lot more checks and balances in the way that we, you know, start to have these policies and this legislation, and there needs to be a lot more involvement, as Lucinda was saying, around making sure that people who are the most marginalised, people who have gotten the most from using social media, but are also the most affected by content moderation to start, or the lack of content moderation being more correct, are actively involved in the development of the legislation or the policies within the social media platforms that these are targeting.
I don't know enough about the legislation, and so I tend to defer to my wiser colleagues at ADM+S around some of those issues. But the one thing I would say is I think it's important to call out some of the agendas at play. So for instance, like in the US, the push from very powerful tech companies to have self-regulation as the model, right? And there's, you know, very real motivations at stake there and sort of market forces behind that. But the reason I think that's really concerning is, like, you see the extreme sort of endpoint of that kind of thinking is there's one of the proposals in like the AI value alignment space and AI safety space around how to solve content moderation and conflict online is there's a paper called Parallel Universes, where they literally say, no one needs to interact with anyone else. All these individual communities can just be siloed from each other. And that's sort of like, you know, subreddits, but on steroids. And so that's just, you're literally describing a complete breakdown of social function in online spaces. And so I think it's important to call out those sort of agendas and actually say, no, there is a space for regulation, and self-regulation won't be enough.
Thank you. And to end also on a hopeful note, I wanted to ask you if there are any projects, or even if there are papers or things that are making you hopeful right now, examples of content moderation done right, whether it's automated or non-automated.
Well, there's I haven't fully digested it, but the Australian government recently introduced an exposure draft. I should have mentioned this in my last answer, for a piece of legislation for combating misinformation and disinformation, which is open, I think, until the 8th of August for feedback. And they did mention inciting hatred as one of the things that disinformation can do, which I was glad to see that acknowledged. So we're now trying to work out how to make sure that it doesn't fall over by having some proper definition of what dehumanizing material, you know, what that looks like online.
I'm a cautious optimist when it comes to technology, but there's, I think, a little bit of cause for optimism maybe so for example, these large language models that we're seeing with new capabilities now, especially around, so we talked about content and the lack of taking into account context with like threaded comments, for example, is a really basic example. But it's really exciting to me that, for example, ChatGPT or Claude or these large models, you can teach them with like 1 or 2 examples to recognize a new structure of content, and then actually say, okay, now here's some threaded content examples of comments, and now classify that for me. So you can actually sort of adapt these models in really efficient ways to perhaps handle more broad types of structured content, which I think could be a promising avenue for accounting for context with more nuance, and also obviously for different data types. Like we've seen some promising results with assessing humor in memes, for example, where the data is images and text rather than just text, and so moving beyond just that text framing, perhaps.
As I was saying before, I think the documentation of these experiences being done by people who have lived experience in it. So I'm thinking like Hacking and Hustling Collective over New York, Carolina Air, who is at University of Birmingham, the team at Salty that worked with the University of Michigan, Center for Intimacies Justice in New York, and also Daniel Del Moncio, I think. And basically what they're doing is they're being able to document algorithmic gossip in a way which is, you know, accessible to people who aren't in those communities. And it's being able to as I was saying before, it's actually changing the way that platforms are thinking and dealing with sexual content. The other thing which I think is often left out of the conversation around content moderation when we're talking about stuff that we don't want online is thinking about what do we actually want in terms of positive environments around these things. So I really wanted to give Zara Stardust up at QUT a big shout out for the work that she and a number of other sex researchers from all around the world led in the development of the manifesto of sex positive social media, which I highly recommend that everyone checks out.
I'll keep it quick because I study misogyny, so sometimes things get dark. But I think the things that are kind of maybe most exciting to me at the moment, at risk of sounding like a corporate shill, there are a couple of, and I don't want to put all my faith in it, so as my disclaimer, but there seems to be some more recognition of the harms of things like microaggressions and the subtler kind of forms of misogyny in some of the corporate content moderation spaces, as in some of the companies that are proposing to be able to, help different organizations manage. Partly, I think it's out of brand management and things like that. But it's like a little glimmer of hope amongst the capitalist ruins that there is. Sorry, I'm not doing great on the hope front. But that people are starting to think about these things, and starting to recognize that you can actually kind of go further than what's just explicitly illegal and try and cultivate safer and better communities. This is a space that's happening. This is something that's happening at the moment in some sporting organizations, trying to kind of shield their players from some really horrendous abuse, but also from microaggressions and the subtler forms of racism and sexism and things like that. So I'm excited about that. And I think I also draw hope, I suppose, from some of the really well-moderated smaller communities that I'm part of, communities where there are shared values and where people hold each other accountable and can have discussions about these sorts of things. And I know there's a big, jump between those smaller communities where that works really well and, the broader internet. But I think you have to take hope out of some of that to see that it can be done and really nice spaces can be kind of cultivated if we put the time and effort and care into it.
Great, thank you. So that means it's your turn with your question. So I'm hopefully getting on Slido. And I think we're doing okay for time. I'm looking for Kathy too. Okay, yes. Abdul is my Kathy. Okay, I have a question. So more of a comment than a question is my is the most upvoted question. How awesome is this primarily early career panel?
Oh, okay. We'll take that.
I'm loving these questions. This is just a comment to say that you're all very awesome.
I'm just going to
And
jump.
I promise these are the most upvoted. I'm not just picking them because... Okay,
I
now we
reckon
have...
it's because it's mostly HDRs left and ECRs in... Raise your hands up. Yeah, it's like half the audience. So thank you so much for sticking around and listening to us talk today.
I love that. I actually do think it's a really nice... It's really nice that we're ending with a much more ECR heavy, because I think it also reflects the ADM+S's approach of really lifting up early career researchers. So, yay. Okay, now we have a serious question. Given asymmetries in power relations in social media platforms, how do we ensure automated moderation is not co-opted as a tool for US or Western imperialism? So small question. Anyone wants to stop?
That's the question that keeps me up at night. Okay, so obviously working in the Christchurch Call Advisory Network, we think about this a lot in the counterterrorism infrastructure space in terms of how things can then be weaponized, and coming from a community that is fighting for protection from dehumanization, but also fighting from being marginalized by over-policing and carceral approaches and surveillance. We're very, very, very concerned all the time about the balance, and we're also very concerned about ownership of technology, and I think that a lot of the principles around data democracy, governance over data, and democratic governance of data are very important to us, because we are worried about technology being used as a weapon, but on the other hand, we do need technology to be developed that the Australian government can use, that has enough so that regulators, for example, like eSafety, ACMA, eventually can use to identify dehumanising material, and it needs to be developed in a way that reflects best practice of involving community and having a process for constant civil society and researcher review and human review. So I would like us to see us model that in Australia, and then have some rules around transparency for corporates and for governments when it comes to takedowns and whatever they're proposing to do in relation to material.
As a starting point, I would love to see more work to convince tech companies that there is a colonialism issue. And so we saw a little bit about that in Beck Johnson's The Panel on Generative AI just before this, look at the World Values Survey, and the fact that actually there is differences in values internationally, surprise, and that these get encoded into models based on where they're built. And so there's also some good research coming out of Germany showing the same sort of thing. And so, yeah, it would be great to have domestic models. The Oz GPT. Anyone? Yes? No?
Because Australia has a great history of anti-colonialism.
Could I use my, just to say something very quickly on this point, because it's, I'll be quick. I think it's a really interesting question. As you know, the EU Digital Services Act is coming into force now, and something we've been finding is it's like sort of the EU is like a microcosm of all of these challenges, because there's a tendency when we talk about the EU to think of Europe as this one homogeneous, region, and the reality is you have vastly different cultures, legal systems, etc. So what something like the Digital Services Act talks about, a single concept like illegal, means very different things in very different countries in ways that often conflict with human rights. So I think we have good opportunities with this regulation, rather than just to champion it as this amazing golden standard, to actually learn lessons from how some of these values might conflict, and what we can learn from that. Yeah. So sorry to take that time, but just wanted to add.
Definitely not my area of expertise per se, and I think that Rita really gave a great answer on it. But I also want to kind of continue that by thinking of, it's not just, how race and colonialism plays into this, but it's also about the values that are coming through in terms of, how we look at everyday life. So if we look at sexual cultures, obviously the whole way that we talk about sex on the internet has changed because of, as I said before, Cess to Foster. But what you see with that is that's coming from a very American view. So even these things that you wouldn't, traditionally think of colonialism in that kind of global community of these social media practices, it infuses in everything. It's so insidious. So being able to use something like the Digital Services Act in the EU as an opportunity to dive off and see how can we balance, national legislation, how can we balance the differentiation and the nuances that we have in anti-discrimination law in different places or in different continents. It's going to be a really exciting and hopefully, useful next couple of years when we see that that comes into practice. But it could be an opportunity as well. It's not always that bad.
Might go for the, so this is from Dan Angus. What are your thoughts on the use of content flags or notes and other community-based moderation tools that add context to possibly contentious material?
I mean, I love them, but I guess I can't speak to whether they're, I don't think they're a whole solution, right? There's times when I found, for example, content notes on Twitter with additional information really helpful for spotting mis and disinformation. But I think, like, it's something I've been reflecting on in sort of my area of work, mis and disinformation around the Depp and Heard trial, for example. The kinds of people who are sharing that content are probably, or the majority of them are probably not going to see something like a content note and go, oh, never mind, because there was that active contestation over the truth in a way that like, I guess I can only speak to my work particularly here. So I think there's a place for them, but, and there is some, very helpful, they can be really helpful in some situations. But I think particularly in sort of the spaces that Rita and I are working in, you're kind of dealing with people who have, like, there's an underlying lens or an underlying ideology that informs how they will read those things anyway. So that was a bit off the cuff, but that's my initial feels.
I'd say the same. So my background is public health, and I'd say the same stuff happens with COVID misinformation. Like, you either have people at one end of the spectrum or the other, and very few people, well, actually maybe I'm underappreciating how many people actually found content moderation notes around COVID misinformation or COVID information useful. But I do think that in terms of being in a post-truth world, there is value in being able to direct the conversation with those kind of norms which are based on evidence as opposed to based on billionaires' values.
Aaron, would you?
I love that we're slowly just like, yep, no, we all agree, it's all done.
Okay, so I'll go to the next then. So this is from Maddie Sterling. It's directed to Rita. Do you have any involvement with other religious groups or minorities? And if so, are they subject to the same kinds of dehumanizing behaviors online?
Yes. I hope Twitter and Facebook aren't here. Are they here? Because legally they'll probably try to argue that we have legal actions for full disclosure against Facebook and Twitter at the moment. And legally they'll probably try to argue that we're not discriminated against because everyone faces hate speech. But we have a counter argument to that, don't you worry. So yes, it very much is the case that we are in touch with, so we've spoken with the Online Hate Prevention Institute, which has a lot of expertise in anti-Semitic hate speech, and the other communities that are really affected, I would say, are the First Nations community, particularly in the context of the Voice to Parliament. It's been really, really bad. And we've been trying to reach out and help on that. I know that there is some projects happening. We heard from RMIT and Reset Australia, and I think Purpose, some different bodies are doing things in this space. But who else? We've also had a lot of conversations behind the scenes with different legal researchers and hate speech researchers. Professor Nicole Aswith from University of Tasmania, who's done a lot of work on verbal and textual hostility. Stuart MacDonald over in the UK, who's done a lot of work on incitement. They've all reviewed our working definition on dehumanising material. I think our issue at the moment is that a lot of the communities that are targeted by hate speech are not necessarily communities that hang out and can do stuff, can advocate and act in solidarity and work as a united front publicly together. And if you think about it, think about the communities that are targeted: Muslims, Jews, trans. I mean, do you see these three people sitting in a bar together? I mean, this is the reality we're dealing with. These communities are all targeted, and we kind of know the group that's targeting them. We don't want to name them, but I think that the reality is that we as a vehicle moving forward in terms of advocacy, we're all sort of doing our advocacy and talking a bit behind the scenes, but our ability to work together as a public strong front is challenging, very challenging. And we've been able to do it in certain spaces like hate crime reform in Queensland. I led a coalition of about 25 different religious and cultural groups to get hate crime reforms up in Brisbane. Again, that couldn't include the LGBT community because of concerns, across those groups. And so there was informal connections that were happening behind the scenes. And I think, again, we are hamstrung in that sense, and this is where researchers can really step in and help, because you have a more neutral position in a way, in the sense that you're not there to represent one community, and you can collaborate, you can bring across all those people, and you can help overcome that barrier that we're facing, and just bring it together in a way that is evidence-based, that is strong, that is compelling to government, and potentially also to social media platforms, but I don't unfortunately share your optimism in this space because of my experiences. Sorry.
We didn't have 4 minutes left. I would have said that's a really good ending call for action for us as researchers. But we do have time for one more. But yeah. So this is from Fan Yang. When it comes to the online reporting system, how can we make the system more accessible to users being targeted? Who would like to go?
I might jump quickly because there's a lot of this sort of stuff in the gender-based violence space. Gosh, I mean, there's like a lot of work on this, right? So there's a lot of research about the way, for example, having to report individual pieces of content sort of related to what we spoke about is really exhausting if you have to step through every single thing each time. So now some platforms are trialing things where you can select multiple pieces of content at the same time. Another thing that kind of happens is there's now on some platforms options to give more context or to refer to other tweets to show the way those things are all connected. Things like racism and sexism are, hidden by the fact that they're referring to another tweet that refers to another tweet, those sorts of things. There's also, I guess, there's a lot of things going on there, but I'm just going to take my privilege as a speaker and say, I also want to really emphasize that, yes, accessibility, if that is great, we should do more of it. But also, when you're getting, thousands of these sorts of messages a day, there's no real accessible way for, in a lot of the misogyny sort of spaces, women get targeted by, hundreds of or thousands of messages a day, and there's no real accessible way to deal with that. That's something that someone else needs to be stepping in, because we shouldn't really be putting the burden on survivors. And I should clarify, I don't think that that's what the person who asked the question was suggesting, but I just want to highlight it while we're here.
On the exact same thing, I think moving away from a mindset of moderating content or flagging content and reporting content to moderating behavior. That sounds ominous when you say it out loud. But yeah, rather than pieces of content individually, the ability to even report patterns of behavior over time and to have that data historically available in a reporting interface would be a great starting point, I think, which we've seen some small steps in that direction, but yeah, there's more improvement needed.
And I think that there's also a growing understanding that we need to do something about strategic flagging of content based on particularly trans people's content is increasingly being targeted by alt-right groups. So there needs to be mechanisms in place that allow the recognition of when there's 500 people flagging something, what does this mean when the content's like this? And on the other side of that, for people who are experiencing their content being taken down, their accounts being taken down, there needs to be a lot more transparency, because at the moment, the only way, that a sex worker or a sex educator or even a sexual health organization can get their account back is if someone goes to the media, has a contact in the platform, and causes a fuss. When in reality, you know that the people who are most targeted through content, like strategic content moderation by users, are people who don't have those connections. They don't have the money to be able to make a fuss about something. So we need to create more transparent ways for people to be supported through that process, whether they're having to, get through all of the vitriolic abuse in their everyday life of just existing in social media, or when they're being removed from social media, being removed from their communities, and being removed from their workplaces.
Rita, would you like to add anything? Are you leaving us with your big takeaway from the earlier one? Okay, so with that, thank you so much, and big clap for the panel.